Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a quiet turning point in the life of a deeply feeling soul. A point not marked by fanfare, but by an inward quake. It is the moment the empath, long devoted to the needs of others, dares to choose themselves. This is not selfishness, it is not abandonment. It is a sacred return. A reclamation of the self that has been scattered in the winds of emotional caretaking. And when this moment arrives, something profound stirs in both the empath and the world around them. Let us now descend into the psyche and explore what truly happens when the empath finally, and unapologetically, chooses themselves. For the empath, life is often a stage where they perform roles they never consciously auditioned for. They become the helper, the listener, the emotional sponge, absorbing pain, always making space for others, often at the cost of themselves. Over time, this adaptation is so complete, so habitual, that they begin to forget where the performance ends and where they begin. They derive meaning and identity from being needed, from easing tension, from offering light in dark rooms, and yet something within them begins to dim quietly, unnoticed even by themselves. The persona they wear, the one that is agreeable, accommodating and endlessly nurturing, becomes not just a mask but a second skin. This persona is not false in the way a lie is false, rather, it is false in the sense that it is incomplete. It is a fragment presented as the whole. There comes a moment, often precipitated by exhaustion, heartbreak, or a long-ignored intuition, when the empath senses a fracture. This fracture is subtle at first, a resistance to answer the phone, a sigh before offering help, a strange hollowness after giving too much. The world, once filled with noise of other people's needs, begins to echo back the emptiness of their own unmet desires. It is here, in this strange and disorienting space, that the collapse of the false self begins. This collapse is not dramatic. It does not look like rebellion. It looks like silence. It looks like pulling back. It looks like no longer over-explaining. The empath begins to detach, not out of coldness but out of an instinct for survival. They begin to realize that the image they have so carefully maintained, of being the strong one, the soft one, the endlessly available one, has become a prison. This disillusionment is painful. Because the empath has often defined themselves by how much they can endure, how much they can carry, how indispensable they can be to others. The loss of that role can feel like death. And in a sense it is. It is the death of an identity built on self-abandonment. The grief that follows is not just about relationships lost or roles relinquished, but about the recognition of just how long they have lived away from themselves. Memories resurface, moments when they laughed off disrespect, swallowed their pain, contorted themselves to be more likable, more palatable, more needed. They begin to see with devastating clarity that what they called love was often control. That what they called compassion was often compliance. That what they called peace was often silence in the face of their own inner chaos. And yet beneath that grief, there is a strange relief. A small voice begins to whisper truths that had been long buried beneath the noise of people pleasing. It says you are tired and that tiredness is valid. It says, you have nothing to prove. It says your worth is not a transaction. It says you are allowed to exist for yourself. As this voice grows louder, the empath finds themselves pulling further from their identity depended on being the one who is always there. They start asking different questions. Not, what do they need from me? But, what do I need right now? Now can I fix this for them? Was this even mine to carry? This shift unsettles the people around them. Those who once relied on their emotional labor may call them distant, selfish, or changed. And they are right, they have changed. Not into something new but into something real. What collapses is not love but the illusion of it. What dies is not their kindness but their compulsion. What fades is not their soul but the mask that concealed it. They are no longer motivated by guilt or the fear of abandonment. They no longer trade authenticity for acceptance. And in the space where the false self once lived, something else begins to grow. Something less performative and more enduring, something deeper than the need to be needed. The empath's inner voice is not truly absent in their years of self-sacrifice. It is only muted, drowned beneath the ever-growing volume of other people's emotions, needs, and crises. It whispers from beneath layers of social expectation, familial conditioning, and the deeply embedded belief that love must be earned through service. That voice once spoke clearly, long ago, in childhood perhaps, before the empath learned to override their own needs in order to feel safe or accepted. But over time, they were taught, whether through subtle signals or direct wounds, that their feelings were too much, their needs were inconvenient, their presence was only welcome when useful. So the voice grew quieter, not because it lacked truth, but because the empath learned to survive by silencing it. They replaced their inner compass with external cues. Body language, tone shifts, moods in the room. They learned to scan others for discomfort and adjust themselves accordingly. Until their own preferences became hazy and indistinct, like a distant radio station barely heard through static. But when the empath chooses themselves, that voice begins to return, at first tentatively, like a creature emerging after a long winter. It does not shout. It doesn't need to. It comes back as a question asked in the stillness. What do you want? And at first the empath may not know how to answer. Their instincts still reach outward, scanning the environment for permission. They still worry they are being selfish for even asking. But the question persists, and with it, a shift begins. The empath starts noticing when they say yes but mean no. They begin to observe the tiny pangs of resentment that rise after overextending themselves. They hear the fatigue in their own voice when they reassure someone while quietly falling apart inside. These moments become harder to ignore, not because they are new, but because the inner voice is finally rising to meet them. The voice grows stronger with each act of self-honesty. It speaks when they hesitate to answer a call from someone who always drains them. It speaks when they leave a conversation feeling invisible, when they shrink to avoid conflict, when they say sorry for simply having boundaries. It says, "This isn't who you are anymore." And it is not a voice of condemnation. It is the voice of remembering. Remembering what it feels like to be whole, to not shift in every room, to not need to be small in order for others to feel big. It begins to draw distinctions that were once blurry, the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and self-erasure, between loyalty and self-betrayal. The empath begins to see where they gave when they had nothing left. Where they tolerated in the name of peace. Where they performed in the hope of being seen. As the inner voice becomes familiar again, it brings clarity that feels both liberating and terrifying. Liberating, because they no longer feel beholden to roles that exhaust them. Terrifying, because their identity was wrapped so tightly around those roles that letting go feels like floating untethered. But they do not float, they begin to root. Root into their own intuition, their own rhythm, their own truth. They begin to trust the uneasy feelings they once dismissed. They begin to believe that their discomfort is not weakness, but wisdom. Then perhaps for the first time, they understand that their needs are not interruptions but instructions, guiding them back to themselves. This shift does not make them less empathic, it makes their empathy cleaner, freer. No longer entangled in hidden agendas or the quiet desperation to be needed. They start to speak not in softened tones designed to protect everyone else's feelings, but in clear, direct words that honor their own. They are no longer guided by the fear of disappointing others, but by the deep longing to find in integrity with themselves. And as this voice continues to rise, not from pride but from truth, the empath discovers that their real power was never in their ability to bend, absorb or please, but in their capacity to listen to what they have always known. That were too afraid to claim boundaries are one of the most misunderstood aspects of human connection, especially for the empath whose identity has been shaped around giving, accommodating, and softening their own edges to avoid discomfort in others. For the empath, boundaries can feel like cruelty, like abandonment, like a betrayal of their own nature. They've often been told, directly or indirectly, that love means sacrifice, that kindness means availability, that goodness means saying yes, even when every part of them is quietly screaming no. And so they learn to override their instincts, to hold their breath in the presence of violation, to excuse patterns that drain them. Simply because they understand where those patterns come from. They know the wounds that drive others, and in their deep compassion, they make room for behaviors that cross their lines. But over time, this accommodation becomes erosion. It chips away at their sense of safety, their emotional clarity, their physical energy, until they are no longer sure where they end and others begin. The shift begins when the empath finally sees the cost of this pattern. Not just in their relationships, but in their body, their sleep, their peace of mind. They begin to notice how much time they spend recovering from interactions that don't feel mutual. They notice the tension in their chest after holding back how they really feel. The migraines after another conversation where they manage the other person's emotions instead of expressing their own. And slowly, something within them begins to stir. A quiet but steady resistance to the idea that love must come at the expense of self. They begin to suspect that boundaries are not a wall against love, but a container for it. That true connection cannot exist without space for truth. That the only relationships worth keeping are those that honor the lines drawn in honesty rather than fear. At first, setting boundaries feels foreign, even violent. The empath fears the reaction. Will they be seen as selfish, cold, arrogant, unkind? Will they be abandoned? Will the people they love turn away? These fears run deep, because for the empath, attachment often came with conditions. Somewhere along the way, They learned that approval could be lost if they stopped pleasing. But they begin to realize that any relationship that hinges on their self-abandonment is not a relationship at all. It is a performance, a contract of unspoken manipulation, a subtle exchange of silence for proximity. And with this realization, the empath takes their first steps toward reclaiming their space. They begin to say no without explanation. They begin to leave situations that once held them hostage out of guilt. They stop cushioning their words with unnecessary apologies. They begin to let silence hang where they used to rushing with reassurance. They no longer respond immediately to every demand, no longer drop everything to soothe chaos that is not theirs to hold, and in doing so they begin to feel the shape of their own self more clearly. Their time, their energy, their emotions become sacred. They become something to guard, not just give away. The boundaries once feared as barriers reveal themselves as bridges. Bridges between their truth and the world. Bridges that allow others to meet them where they truly are, not where they pretend to be. The world begins to shift in response. Some people resist, push back, manipulate, guilt-trip, test the limits. But the empath, now aware of the cost of compliance, no longer bends in the same way. They allow discomfort to be present without rushing to fix it. They allow others to feel disappointed without internalizing it as failure. They understand that protecting their peace may upset those who benefited from their lack of it, but they no longer equate discomfort with wrongdoing. What emerges as a strange kind of power, not loud, not forceful, but deeply rooted. A power that does not need to justify itself. A power that simply is, grounded in the knowing that saying no to others is, at times, the deepest way of saying yes to oneself. The empath is taught, almost from the beginning, to fear their own anger. It is framed as dangerous, disruptive, unkind, something that must be managed or hidden for the sake of peace. And because the empath so deeply values harmony, connection, and emotional safety, they learn to suppress this primal energy, to tuck it away beneath layers of understanding, rationalization, and forgiveness. They tell themselves that anger is beneath them, that it makes them no better than those who hurt them, that compassion is the higher path, and in doing so, they cut themselves off from one of their most sacred inner guides. What they do not realize for years, sometimes decades, is that anger does not disappear, it only goes inward. It festers in the form of resentment, self-doubt, chronic fatigue, anxiety, and a persistent ache that something is off but cannot be named. It sits in the body like a caged animal, growing restless, turning its claws not on others, but on the self who has silenced it in the name of being good. When the empath begins to choose themselves, truly choose themselves, not just as a concept but as a daily practice, they start to hear that quiet growl from within. It's not loud at first. It doesn't scream or rage. It trembles. It says something about this isn't fair. It says you were hurt, and that mattered. It says you have crossed your own line one too many times. And at first, the empath tries to hush it, to smooth it over with logic and empathy, to tell it to quiet down because surely the other person didn't mean harm. But the voice doesn't quiet this time. It grows stronger. It begins to show them patterns. How many times they minimized themselves to protect someone else's ego. How often they swallowed their truth to avoid being abandoned. How deeply that internalized the belief that their needs are burdensome. This anger, once feared, becomes a light illuminating the places they have betrayed themselves in the name of peace. And then, something begins to shift. The empath stops explaining away harm. They stop giving endless benefit of the doubt to people who repeatedly cross their boundaries. They begin to feel their own fury. Not as destruction, but as clarity. Not as punishment but as awakening. This anger is not chaotic, not reckless, not cruel. It is intelligent. It is sharp. It is sacred. It is the part of them that remembers who they were before they were taught to shrink. It is the part of them that knows love without respect is not love. Giving without consent is not generosity. Silence in the face of harm is not compassion. The empath begins to see that anger is not the opposite of love. It is the defender of it. It rises up to protect what has been too long unprotected. It sets fire to the lies they told themselves to survive. It tears down the walls of false harmony and dares to rebuild something more real. They begin to speak in ways they never have before. Their voice carries weight. Their eyes no longer plead for understanding, they claim it. They say things like, "I will not tolerate this. That is not acceptable. I'm done explaining myself," and in doing so, they draw a line in the sand that even they had been unwilling to draw before. Some people fall away, some push back harder. Some accuse them of being angry, bitter, or changed. And they are right, they are changed, not hardened, not closed off but finally intact, finally aligned. Finally willing to let the fire burn what must be burned, so that they may rise from the ashes not as a ghost of someone else's comfort, but as the full embodiment of their truth. This anger does not consume the empath, it liberates them. It does not lead to chaos, it leads to sovereignty. It is not something they must apologize for, but something they must honor. Because in the end, it was never the anger that was dangerous. It was the silence that buried it. The empath learns that their fire was never the enemy. It was the medicine they were taught to fear. The flame that leads them back not just to themselves, but to a self that no longer needs to dim their light to be safe, to be accepted, to be loved, as the empath begins to choose themselves. Not in fleeting moments but as a way of life, something subtle yet powerful begins to shift in the energetic field around them. For so long their presence has radiated openness, softness, availability. A signal that they are safe to lean on, to confide in, to ask without reciprocation. People are drawn to empaths for this very reason. Their energy feels like refuge, their ability to attune feels like a gift. But much of this magnetism has come at a hidden cost. It has come from a place of unconscious overgiving, from a frequency of trying to be enough, to be worthy, to be needed. And so, the empath attracted relationships, situations, and environments that mirrored that imbalance. That fed off their energy without replenishing it. That mistook their silence for agreement, and their forgiveness for permission. The empath may have spent years surrounded by people who adored them for how much they gave, but not for who they truly were beneath the giving. When they begin to choose themselves, this frequency changes. The energy that once said, "I am here for you no matter what," begins to say, "I am here for myself first." And although this shift is often invisible to the eye, it is felt deeply by those around them. The dynamic changes, the silent contracts dissolve. The people who relied on their self-abandonment feel the difference, even if they can't articulate it. Some withdraw, some become reactive, some try to re-establish the old patterns through guilt or manipulation. But the empath no longer takes the bait. They are no longer compelled to rescue someone from discomfort at the expense of their own integrity. They no longer interpret someone else's disappointment as a reason to adjust their boundaries. They simply stay rooted in the new energy they are learning to embody. An energy that says, "I value connection, but not at the cost of myself." And then something even more extraordinary happens. The energy they once poured outward begins to circulate within. It nourishes their nervous system, heals their emotional body, strengthens their intuition. They feel less drained, more present, more grounded. Their creativity returns, their laughter becomes less polite and more full. Their presence, once defined by softness alone, now includes something solid, something unshakable. And this new frequency begins to attract differently. They find themselves in conversations that energize rather than deplete. They meet people who are curious about their needs, not just eager to receive their care. They form connections rooted in mutuality, not dependency. They experience love that feels peaceful rather than performative. And they begin to understand on a visceral level that they never had to prove their worth to be loved. They only had to stop offering love from a place of depletion. The empath's relationships become mirrors, not masks. The ones who remain are those who see them clearly, who value the full spectrum of their humanity. Not just the light, but also the shadows, the needs, the truths. These relationships may be fewer, but they are deeper. And the emptiness that once drove the empath to overextend themselves begins to dissolve, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of being seen, chosen and loved for who they truly are. The paradox reveals itself that in choosing themselves, they did not lose love, they made space for the kind of love they always deserved. Love that does not require them to shrink. Love that does not ask for silence. Love that flows in both directions. Love that honors not just the heart that gives, but the soul that knows when to receive. There is no longer a need to perform. No longer a compulsion to anticipate every emotion in the room. No longer a desire to prove goodness through exhaustion. The empath walks through the world differently now. Not because they have closed themselves off, but because they have come home to themselves. And from that place of inner alignment, they no longer chase connection, they become connection. No longer surviving through sacrifice, they thrive through self-truth, radiating not the energy of availability, but the quiet power of wholeness. In the depths of the sacred chamber where the self waits patiently to be chosen. For the empath, the journey to that chamber is long and tangled, paved with sacrifice, silence, and suppression. But when they finally arrive, when they finally choose themselves, they do not become less compassionate. They become conscious. No longer asleep in the dreams of others, they awaken in their own. And from that awakening, they do not abandon the world, they serve it better, because they are no longer lost within it. Thank you.